Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kevin Butterfield, director of the John W. Kluge Center. My great pleasure to be sitting here with Tanisha Fazal, a professor of political science at the University of Minnesota and the author of a new book, Military Medicine and the Hidden Costs of War. Thanks for being here at the Library of Congress.
Thank you for having me.
I'm curious about your track into writing this book. There's a deep study of the history of medicine across multiple wars from the 19th century into the 21st. And it doesn't seem to track exactly with the previous publications that I see on your own publication record. How did you get started down this path?
Well, there is, I guess, maybe one similarity with some of my previous work, which is that I have a little bit of a history of coming to my research projects as a result of being annoyed. And in this case, what happened was that I was writing my second book, which is on international humanitarian law or the laws of war, and I had a paper out of that book on why it is that we no longer see peace treaties in wars that states have with each other. And, you know, like academics do, I was trying to get that paper published, and one of the peer reviewers for that paper really wanted me to engage with what was at the time a new literature arguing that war was in decline. And that led me to
This is Steven Pinker, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that led me somewhat begrudgingly to pull Pinker's book off the shelf. And it was, you know, I had it, I was going to read it one day, but it's really long. And so I start reading it, and the first half of this book, which is called The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined, is about kind of interpersonal violence, how we treat our pets, spanking children, things like that. But then the back half of the book is about an argument that Pinker is making about the decline of war. So now we're in my wheelhouse, and I realized really quickly that the empirical basis for Pinker's claim that war was in decline was a decline in battle fatalities. But of course, over the same long arc of history that Pinker is talking about, there have been dramatic improvements in medicine. So effectively what's happened is that battle casualties have been shifted from the fatal to the non-fatal column. And that kind of led to this whole new research agenda on military medicine.
In fact, there's this baseline ratio that's key to your work that I've learned from reading through the first few chapters, is this reference to the wounded to killed ratio. There's even a graph that helps us visualize it. But in reality, this graph could go even farther back in time, probably, and still show something quite consistent. Can you talk to us about the consistency up to a certain point in this wounded to killed ratio?
Yeah, so the wounded to killed ratio is exactly what it sounds like. It's the number of people killed compared to the number of people wounded. And for a very long time, centuries, really going back further, what this chart is just showing you is the wounded to killed ratio just for the United States since the founding of the Republic. But going back further in time and around the world, not just for the United States, the wounded to killed ratio was considered to be very stable at 3-to-1. So the rule of thumb was that for every person killed, you would have 3 people wounded. And this was something that people really set their clocks by. And you know, so much so that if they were trying to fill in data on casualty reports or statistics, they would kind of reverse engineer if they had any missing data using this rule of thumb. But as you see from this chart, for the US, it's really there's a little bit of a jagged line, but it's definitely drifting forward over time, and then really jumps up in the more recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, where, depending on who you talk to, the wounded to killed ratio is somewhere between 10-to-1 and 17-to-1. And I should note also that the wounded to killed ratio does not include disease, it does not include psychological illness. This is, physical wounds that we can observe. And
in the opening paragraphs of the book, you use a Private James Spaulding, I wrote down his name so I can remember this, a real life figure from the Civil War era who served and was wounded in 1865. And you lay out a bit of a different, some alternative biographies that could have happened for Private Spaulding had he served in different wars. One useful starting point for us is what actually happened to him, because I want to start with the Civil War and then move forward in time. Talk to us about Spaulding, if you remember the details of his story. Hopefully you can get it close, but as his story was one of literally millions, literally hundreds of thousands, I should say. But tell me about what happened to him and a little bit about where the Civil War figures as a starting point for your study.
Yeah, so Spalding is wounded in the Civil War, and he kind of does better. He seems like he's on the road to recovery. When you read the medical history, it's all of these very 19th century, not surprisingly, medical terms that sound troubling from the vantage point of the 21st century, because it's not how you would treat somebody today. It seems like he's on the road to recovery, but he ends up succumbing to an infection and dying. And the reason that I begin not only the book, but also it's sort of the first empirical foray, a major empirical foray in the book is a discussion of the Civil War, is because I think it's a really important baseline for thinking about military medicine in the context of the United States. It's in the pre-germ theory of disease era, right, which has real implications for the ways in which disease is handled. It's the first really major war that the US is fighting, and they have to stand up a military medical system in the way that they hadn't before, and there are a number of really interesting advances, but also problems that they can't really solve in the Civil War. And I think it's also a really interesting and important case and provides a baseline for thinking about the way that the United States has dealt with benefits for military veterans as well.
I want to hopefully kind of bifurcate our conversation a bit. I want to look at medicine first and come to benefits in a bit, but these are the two pillars of your work here, the long-term, the long tail of the costs of war come down to those who have served in the war and what happens to them after, including the benefits provided to them. So I want to come to benefits soon. But the Civil War itself, you mentioned that the germ theory of disease is just beginning to emerge. It's certainly no real understanding of it. And disease is a clear killer. But there's also in terms of the battlefield deaths themselves and battlefield wounds, it's different from later wars as well. And I noticed a distinction between gunshot and explosions. Can you talk to us a bit about the different methods of war?
Let's take a look at this chart here. So, in the Civil War and also in World War II, the way that most people who were injured and who die as a result of injury, the cause of injury is gunshot. But then we have the shift starting around World War II from guns to bombs. And if we think about this in the context of the Civil War, gunshot was really problematic, partly because of the very specific type of rifles and even bullets that were used. There's something called the mini ball that was used that really tore through flesh and also fabric. And remember that in the Civil War, people didn't use personal protective equipment. They were effectively dressed the way that you and I are in terms of the kind of protection that their clothing could afford to them. And so you had these bullet wounds tracking dirty fabric through the wounds in an era where there is really no understanding of the germ theory of disease. And so that makes it much more likely that people are going to succumb to infection the way that Private Spalding did.
When we move forward in the book and of course in history, World War I and World War II, you bring these together into the world wars as a way of looking at it. But there is, of course, great change both in medicine and in the methods of warfare between World War I and World War II. One of the things that I'm curious to know more about is by the time we get to World War I, obviously we have a more sophisticated, better understanding of disease and dealing with injury. But we also, I think, it's fair to say that there's a more robust medical infrastructure supporting those who are serving. Can you tell us about the First World War?
Yeah, so I think the First World War is a really interesting case for so many reasons, and one of which is that at the turn of the 20th century, you start to have medicine really become professionalized, certainly in the United States. And one of the consequences of that, which is positive, which is that you have a lot of specialization, and so the US military medical community is much better equipped in a lot of ways to enter World War II, not in every way, and I'll explain why in just a moment. World War I, excuse me, than, for example, the Civil War. And they've also been observing what the Europeans are doing, because remember, the US enters World War I quite late. But at the same time, this military medical community, or really the medical community generally, is remarkably overconfident. So much so that they say they create what they call a safe war, in scare quotes, movements, which just sounds like a complete oxymoron, right?
What did they mean?
What they meant was that this is, we are so good at our jobs that war is going to be no more dangerous than living your regular civilian life. And if you become ill or if you become injured, we're going to be able to get you back to where you were, if not better, which is really, I think, very remarkable. And of course, they were not able to live up to that promise. And World War I think, is also really interesting because even though the medicine is much better, more US troops die as a result of the 1918 flu pandemic than from battle, from injury in battle.
When soldiers are on the front lines, and there were very well-defined front lines in the First World War, as we know, in trenches quite often, there was an awareness in this period to begin to move them away from the field of battle into medical facilities. And there's even a graph that you show in the book that was worked out at the time, am I right? That this was a pipeline, really, of dealing with injured soldiers. First of all, tell us where you found this and a little bit about the kinds of materials that you're able to work with. And tell us about what evacuation of the injured looks like in this period.
Sure. So evacuation is actually really critical to medical care in conflict, or really to trauma care in general, but certainly to medical care in conflict, because somebody is injured on the front line, and you really have to be able to provide medical care at every stage of evacuation. And so you need to have this chain of evacuation, is what it's called, set up pretty clearly. And just going back for a moment to the Civil War, this is something where, oftentimes we talk about military medicine in the Civil War as being somewhat medieval. That's the word that's often used to describe it. But one area where there was significant advancement was actually with respect to evacuation, where Jonathan Letterman, who is appointed as the medical director of the Army of the Potomac, ends up actually standing up a proper ambulance service that's actually fully staffed with ambulance drivers instead of members of the band. For example. What's interesting is that these lessons are kind of lost. Everything that Letterman does, that it's kind of lost somehow in between the Civil War and World War I. And there's a little bit of reinventing the wheel and reminding the US military medical personnel, reminding themselves, oh, this is how we did it in the past, and we should really resurrect this system. And that resurrection is what you see here in this image, which is from the Stanhope Bain Jones paper. Bain Jones was a military doctor in World War I, and it's at the National Library of Medicine History Reading Room, which is, you're an historian. I'm not an historian, but I love history and archives, so I spent a lot of time there. And it was really striking to me when I came upon this document how similar it was, and the echoes of Letterman's work in the Civil War, but also how they really had to get back to where they were. They had kind of forgotten. It was a lesson that had been lost.
And this is something I know that the ability to get to injured soldiers quickly and to bring them the medical care that they need is something that the 20th century made great advances in from this period forward. I wanted to move chronologically, but as I understand it, this is still very much seen as the key to helping soldiers, is to get to them quickly and to be able to offer medical care as soon as possible after the injury.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that doctors figure out very quickly in war, that if you can get people to a higher level medical facility or higher level medical care more quickly, then their odds of survival really shoot up. And In the more recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the principle of the golden hour was applied. And so this is the idea that if you get somebody to higher level medical care within the first, quote unquote, golden hour of injury, then they're really going to be much more likely to survive. And this was not only applied kind of in principle, but it was a rule that was instituted by Gates when he was Secretary of Defense in 2009. He instituted the golden hour rule. So you couldn't actually, you had to be able to evacuate people within that first hour of injury. Now, one of the reasons that you could do this in Iraq and Afghanistan was because the US had air superiority. So there's a lot of air evacuation that's happening, and a lot of not only Army, but Air Force vehicles that are really kitted out for that purpose. And that is part of the explanation for, when I showed you the wounded to killed ratio chart, that rapid increase in the odds of survival, the increase in the wounded to killed ratio. And people sometimes today, everybody's trying to get the golden hour or that time down. People talk about the platinum 15 minutes today.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that clear air superiority versus contested superiority in the skies is pretty key too, right? That, for instance, wars going on in the world right now. I'm thinking of Ukraine. It's something quite different. Am I
Absolutely
right in drawing that conclusion?
No, you're absolutely correct about that. And for sure, U.S. the military in general, but also military medical personnel are paying very close attention to what's been happening in Ukraine, and really noticing that this is a conventional land war, and there's been sort of a pivot in the U.S. foreign policy community in terms of looking ahead to thinking about the possibility of what's called peer or near-peer competition, as opposed to the kinds of wars and the kinds of opponents that the U.S. faced in Iraq and Afghanistan. So thinking about a potential war with Russia or with China, certainly, neither Ukraine nor Russia has air superiority in that conflict, and that has really compromised evacuation time. So when you look at the wounded to killed ratio for the Russians and the Ukrainians, it looks closer to the World War numbers than it does, for sure, than the Iraq and Afghanistan numbers for the US.
One of the things that I learned from the book is it seems to point in both directions. That is, learning lessons from previous wars, but also, as you mentioned before, between the Civil War and the First World War, sort of losing some of the knowledge that you had acquired, hard-won knowledge from the previous conflict. There's a couple of graphs that you show that I think came out of the Cantway Library of Medicine at Harvard that talk about learning, sort of working with the data from the First World War and thinking about the Second World War. Am I remembering this correct? And this is an opportunity to begin to draw some of that information. The clicker not moving forward?
No.
Ah, interesting.
Oh,
there we go. So tell us about this, and I believe I'm right here that these are attempts to sort of draw information from previous conflicts to better inform what we could do differently now. Talk to me.
Yeah, so these are from the Edward Churchill papers at the Cantway Library, which is at Harvard. Churchill was a major figure in the U.S. military medical community in World War II. He was a real dean of American military medicine at the time, a little bit of a controversial figure in some ways, but was behind a lot of significant advances. And what this chart shows is different from the wounded to killed ratio. This is something closer to what's called thinking about the case fatality rate. So of the number of people who you get who are treated, who are trying to treat, how many of them do you save, right? And so what this chart shows is that or it's kind of the flip of that, because it's the mortality, how many people are dying once they're actually treated or seen. And you see that in all these different categories of different parts of your body that could be injured, the mortality rate for World War II is lower than for the previous wars. And so this is, this is the kind of evidence that doctors at the time were really pointing to demonstrate the efficacy of their practices and procedures.
And in the next graph, I recall, this is actually sort of looking at some of the utility of the information gained, am I right, out of the First World War, looking at how it affected and improved outcomes in the Second World War?
Yeah, so there's a little bit of, there are definitely some lessons that are learned, but there are also a lot of lessons that are lost between wars. So for example, some of the medical equipment that was used in World War II was just kind of old World War I medical equipment that had been put in boxes, and people are unwrapping them and they're wrapped in newspaper from 1919, for example. And so that doesn't suggest much in the way of lessons learned. But there were, and part of the reason when you think about the comparison between those two wars is because the US is actually not in World War I for very long. And so there's this really comprehensive 17-volume set, an official medical history of World War I, and reading it through, it was fascinating that there were all these plans that people in the military medical community had made, and they just didn't have time to execute them. And to me, that shows that one of the reasons, or one of the conditions under which you get the most advances in military medicine is the duration of the war, because you just have more time to learn. And so World War I, US participation is very short. World War II, it's much longer. And so there are many more lessons that are learned as a result.
In the book, you quite naturally move into the counterinsurgency wars following the section on the world wars. But of course, there are important conflicts in between Korea and Vietnam. I just wanted to ask you, what might you say about that period in between 1945 and the 21st century? What are some of the outcomes and lessons learned out of Korea and Vietnam that are useful for your study?
Well, I think Korea and Vietnam are interesting. To me, they actually present a little bit of a mystery. Some of that timeline is a little bit of a mystery, but some of it is a little bit of a preview. So the preview part is thinking about, for example, in Vietnam, we're talking about a counterinsurgency war. It has a conventional component similar to the world wars, but it is in a lot of ways a counterinsurgency war, and so that's kind of a preview to what happens in Iraq and Afghanistan, and has implications for, how do we evacuate? What are the kinds of wounds that are sustained? Things like that. What are the types of illnesses that you have to deal with in these different theaters? But there's also a little bit of a mystery for me, which is that part of, when you look at this chart still, why there's so much of an improvement in World War II compared to previous wars has to do with the fact that in World War II, Churchill, who I mentioned, this is from his papers, and who I mentioned earlier, really pushes for the US military to change its transfusion practices. So the US military has been using plasma for transfusion, and Churchill says, no, we need to be using whole blood as opposed to plasma, because not only does it replace fluid, it provides oxygen, which is really what you need. And so he is successful in this crusade, and doctors in the field really notice a difference right away. Sometime between Korea and the conflict in Somalia in the early 90s, the US stops using whole blood in a pre-hospital setting in the field. And I think this is no one's really been able to figure out precisely why. There are some possible explanations having to do with the challenges of blood typing in the field, having to do with the difficulties of screening blood in the field for disease. There were some hepatitis outbreaks as a result of some of these transfusion practices. But for me, that's part of what's really interesting about some of these conflicts in sort of the mid to late 20th century as compared to, as part of the timeline of military medicine from then to now.
There's a lot of detail we can get into in the 21st century conflicts, but I want to focus on one innovation, or a couple of, maybe two topics. The nature of essentially the growing numbers of bombs, IEDs, as we came to learn in the Iraq conflict, and how that changed the nature of injury in the field, but also in particular the ways in which the use of tourniquets in the field came to be massively life-saving and transformative, I don't want to say innovation, because clearly it's not, but an initiative to make the tourniquet available and used. Can you talk to me about either or both of those?
Yeah, so let me, hopefully this will, here we go. Okay, so, you know, as I showed you a little bit ago, there's been this shift in terms of the cause of injury from guns to bombs. And bombs arguably can do a lot more damage to your body in terms of both visible and, you know, internal injuries. So this is from the Emergency War Surgery Handbook, and it shows all the different causes of injury, from blast overpressure to toxic gases. This is somebody who's in an armored vehicle that, you know, the hypothesis here is that they're going over an improvised explosive device. And so that really changes the injury pattern, right? But one of the innovations of the more recent counterinsurgency wars is something that is kind of mundane, but it turns out hugely important. It has to do with data collection. So as a result of having a much more robust system for collecting data in the field, the military and medical community is able to produce evidence-based medicine. And one of the things that they find, and they're relying here on earlier literature that shows that in Korea and Vietnam, 38% of battle deaths were preventable, and they would have been prevented if hemorrhage had been controlled more effectively. And so this is really confirmed by all of this data in the early years of the Iraq and Afghanistan war, and it leads to these new practices around dealing with blood loss. And one of those is the invention, so there's a return to the use of whole blood, which has stopped being used. And you know, Edward Churchill was crusading for it in World War II. Someone named John Holcomb, who ends up using it in the field, and is kind of terrified to do it in the Battle of Mogadishu, is a person who really crusades, or someone who really crusades for it in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. But then there's also this new kind of tourniquet that's invented, which is called the combat application tourniquet. I have one here as well. And the idea behind the combat application tourniquet is that it's sometimes called a one-handed tourniquet or a ratchet tourniquet. And so the idea is that you could just apply it yourself. You don't need somebody else to apply it for you, and that can really be helpful if you're in a firefight, for example, because you don't need somebody else to put down their weapon and defend you. You can even maybe defend yourself. And this has been something that's been considered so useful and so important that in Iraq and Afghanistan on US bases, you would see US troops walking around with these tourniquets loosely applied, so that if they needed to, they could just tighten them and hopefully save their limb and really save their life should they be injured.
I do need to shift to talk about veterans benefits, and then of course I'd like to go to questions from the room and from the online audience. But one of the takeaways is clearly that as we're across 150 years, as our society has gotten better at saving lives in the field, as we've fought brutal and bloody wars, there are many people coming home, surviving, many people not. Obviously fatalities are still a major part of every war, but many people are coming home, and there are both injured and uninjured soldiers returning home. And there is a system in place by which they are recipients of well-earned benefits. And that goes back to the American Revolution, right? We can certainly the Revolutionary War pensions were an important, speaking of data, a very useful data source for historians of the early 19th century, because we have a lot of information about all these pension applicants. But the Civil War pension system is a major expansion of that because of the scope and scale of the Civil War. Tell us a little bit about veterans' benefits from the Civil War into the 20th century.
Okay. It's a tall order.
I know, right?
Do it as succinctly as possible.
You don't have to make it all the way to the present. Just get us started.
Well, I mean, starting with the Civil War, this is I think the Civil War veterans benefit system is a pension-based system, because that's, as you said, that's exactly the system that the U.S. has had basically since the founding of the Republic. But the politics around the pensions look quite different after the Civil War because of both the size of the war and consequently the size of the veteran population. So after the war, in order to get a pension, you have to show that you have some sort of disability that's associated with your military service. But politicians at the time, assisted by lobbying groups like the Grand Army of the Republic, which is a predecessor to the American Legion today, start to realize that, oh, there's this constituency that we can really appeal to if we liberalize the benefit system. And so that's exactly what they do, is they start liberalizing eligibility for veterans' pensions and veterans' benefits, such that by 1893, 40% of the US federal budget is accounted for by these pensions. And so this is actually a real problem in the US just domestically, politically. There's a concern that there's this veterans class, but also just the financial implications. Like, this is a long tail of the costs of war. The last remaining recipient of a Civil War pension, who was the daughter of a Civil War veteran, died in 2020, right? So this is something that lasted a very long time, and it's a real concern for the US upon entrance, or thinking about entrance to World War I. Is one reason that the US was actually reluctant to enter World War I and enters fairly late, and leads to a shift in thinking about the nature of benefits. So it goes from pensions to rehabilitation because you have all these overconfident doctors. But that doesn't work either. So then you get the bonus march, right? This protest by veterans in 1932. And then there's another concern.
Protesting that the benefits being provided to them are insufficient to support them.
Exactly, yes. And in the middle of the Great Depression as well. And so when we get to World War II, there's this concern that, we don't want another bonus march because we're talking about many more people. This would be a disaster. So they reconfigure veterans benefits into something that's more familiar today, which is the GI Bill, which focuses on educational benefits. So it's this idea of like setting up veterans economically, and that really has been the foundation of veterans benefits since.
And there's a couple of graphs in the book that help give some sense of the long arc of what you've just described here. Of course, one of them is right here. The percentage of federal budget spent on veterans benefits is deeply affected by the size of the federal budget, right? Can you just tell us a little bit about what we're seeing here?
Yeah, so you see some spikes here in the start of the graph, which represent what's happening in terms of not only the Civil War, right, because you're seeing some veterans benefits associated with the Civil War, but also World War I and then World War II. But then, the composition of the federal budget changes because the U.S., economy changes over time. And so there's sort of spikes with these different wars, but it seems to level off. But then you really start to see it taking up again in the early 2000s, and that's representing what's happening in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also the fact that in 1973, the US switches from a conscription or draft system to the all-volunteer force. So now all of a sudden you actually really need benefits in order to draw people into the military. And if I can just move forward one more graph, that's very much reflected here. If we look at not the percent of the budget, but just normalized 2002 dollars, how much we're spending on veterans benefits, you see a real increase over time. Because you have to remember that you're always paying not just for the current cohort, but also previous cohorts of veterans at the same time.
And your reference to the all-volunteer Army that we now have, which numbers I think I learned in your book at about 1.5 million active duty at the moment. These are all people who are brought into the armed forces, encouraged and essentially induced to enlist based on their sense of duty, of course, but also benefits, potential benefits. So there's a recruitment package of sorts that's essentially put together. Is that a key part of what's happening here?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that the military is very concerned about recruitment in the era of the all-volunteer force, increasingly so, for lots of reasons having to do with the fact that there's a sense that there are fewer and fewer Americans who are eligible physically, like who are actually would qualify for the military, but also willing to do that. And so the packages increase, and you have the different services competing with each other to try and recruit people into the Marines versus the Army versus the Navy, et cetera. So you really need to have this very strong benefits package in order to get people to join the military today.
Now, we're having this conversation just across the street from the U.S. Capitol. I had a sense coming in, I think somewhat naive, that veterans' benefits were not a political argument to be had, that there was bipartisan support. And I think that's true across much of history. But I learned from your book that maybe some of that is beginning to shift, that there's a bit of political, I don't want to say conflict, but certainly emerging political disagreement about veterans' benefits. Could you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in the last several years in Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's been in the last 10 years or so. The kind of political polarization that we see in the U.S. today is of an older vintage than the past 10 years. But even in that era of political polarization, veterans' benefits were one of the rare issues where it seemed like everybody was kind of on the same page. But 10 years ago, the chairman of the House Veteran Affairs Committee said that veterans' benefits were no longer a sacred cow in American politics. And that was, I thought, a really striking thing to say for somebody especially in that position. And I think that comment was reflecting his own, not just his read of the politics, but to some extent maybe his own politics. And one of the interesting things that I came across in doing the research for the book, especially looking at some of the more recent politics, is, and I would love it if somebody else were to really take this and run with it and see whether this hypothesis is borne out by the empirics, is that there's, I think, potentially an interesting partisan realignment that's happening around veterans' benefits, where historically we think about the Republican Party as the party of the military and the party of veterans, but increasingly Democrats, and maybe this is part of kind of the left's agenda of trying to come up with a more coherent set of foreign policy plans and visions, but increasingly Democrats, I think, have been really investing a lot in veterans' benefits for sure. So think about the debate the last few, just a few years ago about the PACT Act, where you have Jon Stewart out there really arguing strenuously for the PACT Act, and a lot of Democrats on board and really pushing for this, but against significant Republican resistance. And so it will be interesting, it's definitely something I'm keeping an eye on, to see to what extent that's a harbinger of a potential political realignment or partisan realignment around these issues.
The transformation of medicine across roughly a century and a half that you explore in the book, the growing numbers of people surviving injury in war, and this look at, again, across that same century and a half of veterans' benefits and the U.S. national investment in them. These are important historical stories. I'm a historian. I see them as valuable inherently, but you also do have some thoughts about what this might mean, about how the United States policymakers in particular might use this information to think about the future. Tell us a little bit about what you think might be some policy applications of this, the information described in the book.
Yeah, I mean, really the main argument of the book is that these two pillars that you described, these dramatic advancements in U.S. military medicine combined with the expansion, especially since World War II, of the veterans benefit system, have increased the long-term downstream costs of war in ways that we tend not to appreciate. So when we think about the costs of war, when most people think about the human costs of war, they think about it in terms of fatalities. But increasingly, that's not the nature of casualties that U.S. forces are sustaining. They're non-fatal casualties. When most people think about the financial costs of war, they think about how much does it cost to get a fighter jet up in the air. But actually, most of what we're paying for today for the Iraq and Afghanistan wars are about medical care for veterans and other kinds of veterans benefits. So The main argument of the book is that we are systematically underestimating the cost of war, and if you systematically underestimate the cost of something, then you're more likely to buy it, right? So we should really be rethinking how we cost out war ahead of time. One of the things that surprised me in writing the book was that it turns out the US is really bad at costing out war full stop. And I think this is, just time and again, there's an underestimation on the level of, really an order of magnitude of the cost of war when costing out war on the front end. So I think we need a better system to cost out war, again, full stop. But I think that when we do, hopefully improve that kind of system, we really need to think about the costs associated with military medicine and also veterans benefits, because you do tend to see military medicine improving across the course of a war, and you're always going to have veterans benefits in the United States as well. So these are the things that I would, really like policymakers to sort of sit up and pay attention to.
Let's go to questions from the room and from our online audience. We have microphones, so if you're in the room, and I could start over here to my left.
Hi, thank you so much. I have two questions, if you don't mind. The first is whether or not you have seen a lot of evidence as to the counter story of this one, which is that as military medicine has gotten better, arms manufacturers, military contractors, military research have kind of reverse engineered that in order to create deadlier weapons. And the second question is, I do a lot of my research on the revolving door between military and policing and military tactics coming home. If you see something similar happening in the medical field, is as like gun violence is happening and civilian weapons are getting more powerful, if we see tactics of military medicine traveling home and finding places in hospitals.
Yeah, those are great questions. So the first question is about whether there's kind of a back and forth between an intentional back and forth between the improvements in military medicine and the deadliness of the weapons. And I don't think it quite happens that way. I think that there are always arms manufacturers who are trying to make the weapons more and more deadly, but I don't think that they're saying, oh, they've got penicillin now, let's come up with an anti-penicillin, something that's going to, where penicillin won't work or where whole blood transfusion will work. So I don't actually think it's working quite in that way. But your second question about sort of how the revolving door in the military medical community between the military and the civilian world is actually really interesting. I'm going to take a little bit of I'm going to spin it a little bit and say that one of the things that the military medical community is really concerned about right now is something that they call the Walker dip. And the idea behind the Walker dip is that they're essentially worried that their skills are going to become rusty because there isn't a major war, which is a good thing, that the US is involved in right now. And so the thought is to emplace military medical personnel, trauma surgeons, for example, in civilian trauma centers. Now, this is, it's an interesting strategy. It makes me wonder what happens when there is a war, right? What happens to those trauma centers? And that's something that's always historically a problem because, World War II, you have entire hospitals that are essentially decamping to Europe, and that leaves everybody stateside very short-handed. But you also definitely see kind of a back and forth between civilian doctors and military doctors, because a lot of times civilian doctors are they're in earlier eras drafted into military service, and even today you have a lot of people in the reserve and the guard who are, in their civilian lives, are medical personnel, and they take what they learn from either site to the other.
Another question from the room. While we're waiting for one, there's one area I did not touch on, so this is my omission, not yours, because you do discuss it in the book, and that's mental health. Could you talk a little bit about, you could focus on any one period, including the present, or across the entire arc. How does that fit into your study here?
Yeah, so there's a chapter in the book on sort of the invisible, what Adam Montgomery, who's an historian based in Canada, what he calls the invisible injuries of war-induced psychological trauma. And I use that sort of very clunky term of war-induced psychological trauma, which is a lot of syllables, because what we call today PTSD, the version of that was experienced in past conflicts had very different nomenclature. So in the Civil War, they called it, first of all, let me just say that you cannot diagnose somebody, obviously, in 1863 with PTSD today. So I'm not claiming to do that, but war-induced psychological trauma is as old as war itself. I mean, Homer talks about it in the Iliad. But so in the Civil War, they call it sunstroke or nostalgia or soldier's heart. In World War I, of course, it's called shell shock. In World War II, they strategically rename it. They start to call it combat exhaustion or battle fatigue. And the reason that they rename it is because there were so many shell shock casualties in World War I. They want to avoid that, and they also want to avoid the stigma of that. And so the theory that they develop is essentially, we'll give you a respite from the war, and they would literally sedate people for 48 hours or so, to take them out of the fight and then bring them back to their unit. And the hope was that because it was battle fatigue or combat stress exhaustion, they wouldn't be stigmatized in quite the same way that someone with a shell shock diagnosis would. Now today, of course, we don't talk about battle fatigue or combat stress exhaustion. We talk about post-traumatic stress, sort of the primary diagnosis. And that, I think, there's also a really interesting history there, because this is a term that, while it's very familiar today, doesn't really enter, it's not a technical psychiatric diagnosis until 1980. And the reason it becomes one is because a group of Vietnam veterans, and as well as clinicians, mental health clinicians, realized that the American Psychiatric Association can be lobbied, because they've recently observed that the gay community successfully lobbied the APA to remove homosexuality as a disorder. So they lobby them to include PTSD, and they do. And this is actually, we've all, I think, seen this really interesting story of how there's a lot of back and forth and controversy around PTSD. It's become less stigmatized, but then also, going back to the question of veterans' benefits, there's this concern that people are sort of trained to apply for a PTSD diagnosis in a way that will actually increase their disability when they separate from the military. So it's, there's a lot there.
Other questions from the room? I see one in the back row in the center.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could say something about your journey through the archival documents that you've showed us and the different collections that you've used, because I'm assuming you're dealing with quite sensitive information. Did you run into major issues, minor issues?
I love archives, so thank you for that question. I think what's interesting is that what we think of as today as sensitive information was not necessarily thought of that way in, say, the 19th century. So there's a 6-volume official medical history of the Civil War, which has pretty detailed case reports in a way that you would not be able to access and should not be able to access for military personnel in more recent wars. But I just don't think that was a concern at the time. I will say that when the pandemic started, I was working on this book, and I actually had taken out of the library this official history, and it was the copies that I had were from the late 19th century. That's when they were published, and they were kind of crumbling in my hands, and so I had a moment of panic, and I had to switch to digital in order to be able to sleep at night. But a lot of the archival, the other thing that was really interesting to me, or there were a lot of things, but is like looking at these different collections. They're mostly by doctors, and they're almost all men, and certainly all white. And so it really brings home the sort of selection bias in terms of what materials are available to you. But at the same time, they were all friends with each other. And so you can really kind of start to get a complete picture of their conversations with each other, and the way that it was very clubby in a lot of ways, and the ways that the medicine work and sort of the personalities at work as well. If you're interested, there's this one World War II surgeon, Henry Swan, who was a beautiful writer, and his family typed up his letters home with, I think, with the idea of making it a book, and those are available digitally through the National Library of Medicine.
We'll take our final question from, maybe we'll take two more questions. We'll take one from online and one from the room. Okay.
Thank you for the talk. You pointed out a lot of interesting factors that affected how fatal injuries were over the course of history. Are there any kind of similar events that affected how fatal like PTSD might have been, or like how much it may have affected people's functioning after they get home?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question. It's a really hard question to answer historically because, again, you can't diagnose somebody in 1917 with PTSD in 2024. But for sure, we are seeing an increased suicide rate amongst US military personnel today. It's hard to know how much of that is due to PTSD per se, and there's an interesting and important set of controversies around kind of the potential overlap medically between PTSD, for example, and traumatic brain injury and other kinds of blast injuries. Probably a lot of these things are happening together. It's a co-occurrence, but diagnostically it's really difficult to pull all of that apart.
And our last question will come from the online audience.
Yeah, so someone asked, what resources or information sources would you recommend for further study on one's own in the issues of military injuries and military health?
So,
aside from your own book.
So I think if you're interested in military and medical history, there are really, really fantastic sources. But if there's just something that you're interested in looking at for what's going on today, I think, and I will say that for me, one of the most productive kind of approaches to research for this book was actually attending military and medical conferences, which I have to say, as a political scientist, or the exhibition floors of those military and medical conferences, you can imagine, are much more interesting than the exhibition floors for political science conferences, rather. So, there's the Special Operations Medical Association Conference, which is every May, and there's another one, MHSRS, Military Health Systems Research Symposium, which is every September. And that's kind of where you can just go and really be a fly on the wall and really see what what everybody is talking about. And there's kind of a vibe in the room. You can really see dominant themes emerging, in the panel sessions, in keynotes, and just also on the floor, kind of walking around.
Our conversation today has been with Dr. Tanisha Fazal at the University of Minnesota on her new book, Military Medicine and the Hidden Costs of War. Thank you so much.
Thank you.